My grandpa left me his mountain lodge worth $2,200,000. The parents who disowned me at 17 showed up to the will reading, smiling. We'll turn it into a family business. But when the judge reached the final clause, everyone in the room gasped and their smiles instantly shattered. I, 32M, stood outside the law office, staring at the brass nameplate that gleamed in the afternoon sun. My hands were shaking, not from the cold December air, but from the weight of everything this moment represented. My grandfather had died 3 weeks ago, and I'd cried alone in my apartment, unable to attend the funeral because nobody had bothered to tell me it was happening. I'd found out through a random Facebook post from a distant cousin. The receptionist led me to a conference room where the air felt thick with expectation. I walked in and saw them immediately. My mother sat perfectly poised in a navy dress suit, her hair styled the way she'd always kept it, immaculate and controlled. My father was beside her, wearing the same superiority he'd carried my entire childhood. My younger brother lounged in his chair, scrolling through his phone with the casual indifference of someone who'd never been told no. My aunt and uncle sat across from them, whispering to each other with barely concealed excitement. Nobody acknowledged me when I entered. My mother's eyes slid over me like I was part of the furniture, and my father didn't even look up from the documents he was pretending to review. 15 years of silence crystallized in that moment. 15 years since they'd thrown me out for refusing to give up my college fund to bail out my brother's failed business venture. 15 years since my father told me I was no longer his son because I wouldn't fall in line with their plans for my life. But my grandfather had been different. He'd found me 6 months after they kicked me out, working 2 jobs and sleeping on a friend's couch, trying to finish my degree. He'd shown up at the restaurant where I was washing dishes and told me he'd been looking for me everywhere. He hadn't known what happened. They'd told him I'd run away and wanted nothing to do with the family. He'd believed them until something hadn't sat right, and he'd hired someone to find me. From that day forward, he'd been my only family. He helped me finish school, came to my graduation when nobody else did, celebrated every promotion at the engineering firm where I'd built my career from nothing. We'd spent weekends at his mountain lodge, fishing and talking about everything except the family that had discarded me. He never pushed me to reconcile with them, understanding that some wounds don't heal just because time passes. The lawyer entered, a stern woman in her 50s carrying a thick folder. She introduced herself and began the reading without preamble. My mother and aunt leaned forward eagerly as she started listing off the smaller items. My grandmother's jewelry went to my aunt. Some investments were divided between my brother and various cousins. My father received my grandfather's vintage car collection, something he'd apparently been coveting for years based on the satisfied smile that crossed his face. Then came the mountain lodge. The lawyer paused, looking directly at me for the first time, and I saw something in her expression that I couldn't quite read. She explained that the property had been recently appraised at $2.2 million. The lodge itself was pristine, sitting on 80 acres of prime mountain real estate with lake access, completely paid off and maintained impeccably. My grandfather had upgraded everything over the years, turning it into something that could easily become a high-end resort or corporate retreat center. My mother straightened in her chair, and I watched her exchange a look with my father that I recognized from childhood. It was the look they shared when they'd already decided something and were just waiting for everyone else to catch up. My father cleared his throat and announced that the family would need to discuss turning the property into a family business. My mother added that it was the perfect opportunity for everyone to come together to honor my grandfather's legacy by building something that would benefit all of us. My brother finally looked up from his phone, interest sparking in his eyes as he started talking about tourism revenue and vacation rentals. My aunt suggested they could run retreats there, maybe turn it into an event space for weddings. They were already spending the money, already carving up something that hadn't even been distributed yet. The entitlement was breathtaking. Nobody asked me what I thought. Nobody even glanced in my direction. I was just another piece of furniture in the room, invisible and irrelevant, exactly as I'd been 15 years ago when they decided my future without my input and then punished me for refusing to comply. The lawyer let them talk themselves out, her expression remaining carefully neutral. When the room finally quieted, she looked down at the document and began reading the clause that would determine the lodge's ownership. She read my name, and the room went completely silent. The mountain lodge, with all its contents, land, and associated accounts had been left entirely to me. My mother's mouth fell open. My father's face went from confident to confused to red with anger in the span of 3 seconds. My brother actually stood up, as if physical elevation would somehow change what he'd just heard. But the lawyer wasn't finished, and she held up one hand to forestall the explosion of protests. There was a final clause, she explained, written in my grandfather's own hand and properly witnessed. She pulled out a separate sheet of paper and began to read his words directly. My grandfather had written that he was leaving everything to me because I was the only one who'd ever visited him out of love rather than obligation or expectation. I was the only one who'd called just to talk, who'd helped him fix the dock without being asked, who'd sat with him during his chemotherapy treatments when everyone else was too busy. He wrote that he'd watched his own children become people he barely recognized, so focused on money and status that they'd thrown away their own son like garbage when he didn't serve their purposes. But the clause went deeper than simple inheritance. My grandfather had included a specific provision that if any family member contested the will or attempted to claim the property through legal means, I was authorized to release a collection of documents he'd compiled over the past 15 years. The lawyer produced a sealed envelope, noting that its contents included detailed financial records, communications, and evidence that my family had kept from me for years. She didn't elaborate on what those documents contained, but my parents' faces told me everything I needed to know. My mother had gone pale, and my father's anger had transformed into something that looked remarkably like fear. My grandfather, always thorough, had apparently been documenting their behavior, their lies, their manipulations, and he'd given me the nuclear option if they tried to take from me again what was rightfully mine. The lawyer continued reading. My grandfather had written that he hoped this inheritance would give me the foundation to build whatever life I wanted, free from the people who tried to control and diminish me. He hoped I'd use the lodge the way we'd always enjoyed it together, as a place of peace and authenticity. And if I chose to sell it or develop it or turn it into something entirely different, that was my choice to make, just as every choice about my life should have always been mine to make. He ended the clause with a direct message. He wrote that he was proud of the man I'd become despite everything they'd done to break me. He was proud that I'd built a career through my own effort, that I'd maintained my integrity when it would have been easier to compromise it, that I'd never come to him asking for handouts or trying to manipulate him the way others had. He loved me, and he was sorry he couldn't be there to see what I'd do next, but he knew it would be something good because that's who I'd always been. The room remained frozen in silence when she finished reading. I was crying, not caring who saw it or what they thought. These were my grandfather's last words to me, and they meant more than any amount of money or property ever could. He'd seen me. He'd understood. And he'd made sure that his final act would protect me one last time from the people who'd already taken so much. My mother was the first to recover. She started talking fast, saying there must be some mistake, that my grandfather hadn't been in his right mind at the end, that we needed to discuss this as a family. My father was already reaching for his phone, probably to call their lawyer. My brother demanded to know what was in the envelope, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. The lawyer cut through their noise with professional efficiency. The will was ironclad, she explained. It had been written 2 years ago when my grandfather was in perfect health and sound mind, reviewed by multiple attorneys, and properly executed in every legal sense. Any challenge would not only fail, but would trigger the release clause, and she suggested they consider very carefully whether they wanted those documents to become public record. My aunt tried a different approach. She appealed to my sense of family, suggesting that surely I wouldn't want to keep everything for myself when we could all benefit. She reminded me that my grandfather would have wanted us to come together, to heal the rift that had kept us apart. My uncle nodded along, adding that this was an opportunity to start fresh, to move past old hurts and build something new. I looked at them, really looked at them, and saw nothing but calculation behind the performance of family unity. These were the same people who'd stood by silently while my parents kicked me out. The same people who'd gone along with the lie that I'd abandoned the family rather than been thrown away by them. They'd never reached out, never questioned the official story, never cared enough to find out the truth. And now they wanted me to share my inheritance because suddenly family mattered when there was money involved. I spoke for the first time since entering the room. I told them no. Just that single word, calm and final. I watched it land like a physical blow, their faces registering shock that I would dare to refuse them. They'd become so accustomed to people accommodating their demands that genuine refusal seemed to genuinely confuse them. My father tried authority next, his voice taking on the tone he'd used when I was a child, commanding me to be reasonable, to think about what I was doing, to remember my obligations. I almost laughed at the absurdity of him talking to me about obligations after 15 years of pretending I didn't exist. I told him I didn't have any obligations to people who'd made it clear I wasn't their family anymore. I was simply honoring the wishes of the one person who'd actually loved me. My mother shifted tactics to guilt and grief. She talked about how hard this had been for everyone, how my grandfather's death was a tragedy, how we shouldn't let money tear us apart during such a difficult time. The performance was impressive, tears actually welling in her eyes as she spoke about family bonds and healing. But I remembered being 17 and desperate, begging them to reconsider, and seeing those same eyes look at me with cold indifference when I wouldn't give up my college fund for my brother's fourth failed business idea. The lawyer gathered her documents and told everyone that the reading was complete. She provided me with a separate folder containing all the information I'd need to take possession of the property and access the associated accounts. She also gave me the sealed envelope, noting that I should keep it somewhere secure. As she packed up to leave, she mentioned quietly that my grandfather had spoken highly of me during their meetings, that he'd been very specific about his intentions, and that she'd be available if I needed any assistance dealing with challenges to the will. My family didn't leave immediately. They clustered together, whispering urgently, shooting looks in my direction that ranged from angry to calculating. I could see them trying to figure out an angle, a way to manipulate or pressure or guilt me into sharing what my grandfather had wanted me to have. My brother approached, trying for a casual tone as he suggested we grab coffee and talk about this like adults. I declined and walked toward the exit. My mother called after me, her voice sharp with desperation now that the other approaches had failed. She said I was being selfish, that I was spitting on my grandfather's memory by refusing to include the family. The irony of her calling me selfish was so profound I actually stopped and turned around. I asked her if she remembered what she'd said to me the last time we spoke, the day she told me to pack my things and get out. She'd said I was selfish for putting my education ahead of family, that I was ungrateful for not helping my brother when he needed me, that if I walked out that door, I was choosing to be alone. She stared at me, and I could see her trying to recalibrate, to find some response that would give her back control of the narrative. I told her she'd been right about one thing. I had chosen to be alone rather than let them bleed me dry like they'd tried to do to my grandfather for years. And that choice had led me to build a life I was proud of, to become someone my grandfather respected enough to trust with his legacy. I told her I was grateful for that lesson, even if she hadn't intended to teach it. I left them standing in that conference room, their faces showing every emotion except the one that might have actually moved me, genuine remorse. I walked out into the December cold, feeling lighter than I had in years, carrying the folder that represented not just financial security, but validation that I'd been right to stand my ground all those years ago. Update 1. The first few weeks after the will reading were surprisingly quiet. I'd expected legal challenges, harassment, maybe even attempts at manipulation through extended family members. Instead, there was nothing. No calls, no letters, no flying monkeys dispatched to change my mind. The silence was almost eerie after the drama of that day in the lawyer's office. I drove up to the mountain lodge on a Friday afternoon, taking the winding road through pine forest that opened occasionally to reveal stunning valley views. I'd been here hundreds of times with my grandfather, but approaching it as the owner felt surreal. The property was even more beautiful than I remembered. The main lodge was a sprawling timber structure with floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound porch, and a stone chimney that rose 3 stories. The guest cabins dotted the property like something from a luxury resort, each one maintained perfectly. I spent the weekend going through everything, finding my grandfather's presence in every carefully maintained detail. His fishing equipment was organized in the shed exactly as he'd always kept it. His favorite chair sat by the fireplace, the leather worn in the shape of his body. In his desk, I found folders full of memories, photographs of us together over the years, articles I'd written for industry publications that he'd printed and saved, even the card I'd sent him after my first promotion. I also found his journals. He'd been documenting everything, just as the lawyer had suggested. Years of conversations with my parents where they'd asked for money, made demands, expected him to bail out their various schemes. He'd recorded my brother's 6 failed businesses, each one funded partially by family money that was never repaid. He'd documented the lies they'd told about me, the ways they'd tried to turn him against me, their attempts to manipulate him into cutting me out of his life entirely. But he'd also documented the truth. Our conversations, the times I'd helped him without being asked, the relationship we'd built based on genuine affection rather than obligation or expectation. Reading his words about me made me cry all over again. He'd written that I reminded him of who he'd been before money and property had complicated everything, before his own children had started seeing him as a resource rather than a person. The envelope the lawyer had given me contained even more damaging information. Financial records showing that my parents had taken nearly $400,000 from my grandfather over the years, always with promises to repay that never materialized. Communications where my mother had explicitly discussed strategies for getting me out of the will. Even a recorded conversation where my father and brother had discussed challenging my grandfather's competency if he didn't distribute his assets the way they wanted. I understood now why they'd gone quiet. They knew what I had, and they knew that any legal challenge would bring it all into the open. The fear on their faces during the will reading made sense. My grandfather hadn't just protected my inheritance. He'd created a deterrent so powerful that even their greed couldn't overcome their desire to keep their reputations intact. I spent 3 months deciding what to do with the property. I considered keeping it as is, using it as my grandfather, and I had used it. I thought about developing it into the resort my family had envisioned, proving I could build something successful from what he'd given me. I even entertained the idea of selling it and using the money for something entirely different. In the end, I chose a path that felt true to both my grandfather's values and my own vision. I turned the property into a retreat center for young people aging out of foster care. The main lodge became a skills training center where we taught practical life skills, financial literacy, and career development. The guest cabins housed participants in our 3-month program. We brought in counselors, mentors, and professionals from various industries to help kids who'd been discarded by the system build foundations for their futures. I named it after my grandfather, and I poured not just his money but my own time and energy into making it something that would have made him proud. We launched 6 months ago, and we've already helped 43 young people transition into independence. Some went on to college, others to trade schools or entry-level positions we helped them secure. Every single one left with more support and resources than I'd had when my family threw me away. Update 2. The news about the retreat center spread through local media, then picked up regionally when a human interest story highlighted one of our success stories. A young woman who'd aged out of foster care at 18, spent 2 years homeless, and came through our program had just been accepted to nursing school with a full scholarship. The reporter mentioned the property's value and my family connection, apparently finding it noteworthy that someone would convert a multi-million-dollar property into a nonprofit instead of maximizing its profit potential. That's when my family came back. My mother called first, her voice warm and congratulatory in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. She told me she'd seen the news coverage and was so proud of what I'd accomplished. She said my grandfather would have loved what I was doing with the property. She suggested we should get together for dinner, just to catch up, to bridge the gap that had grown between us. I declined politely. She called back 3 more times that week, each message escalating from warm to frustrated to demanding. My father sent an email explaining that they'd been giving me space to process my grief, but now that I was clearly thinking about legacy and family values, perhaps it was time to reconnect. My brother showed up at the retreat center unannounced, trying to push his way past our security to talk to me about an opportunity he wanted to discuss. My aunt and uncle took a different approach. They made a substantial donation to the retreat center, then showed up to volunteer, clearly expecting that this would obligate me to engage with them. When I had our administrator thank them for the donation and politely decline their volunteer application, my aunt sent a long letter about forgiveness and family healing, suggesting that I was being petty and vindictive by excluding them from my life. The truth they couldn't accept was simpler than vindictiveness. I'd built something beautiful from what my grandfather left me, and I had no intention of allowing the people who tried to tear me down to claim any part of it. They wanted association with success they hadn't contributed to, credit for generosity they'd never shown, and rehabilitation of reputations they'd earned through their own choices. I didn't need their approval, their involvement, or their performance of family unity. The young people who came through our program became my family in ways that mattered more than blood. I watched kids who'd been abandoned by every system designed to protect them learn to trust again, to believe in their own potential, to build futures they'd been told they didn't deserve. That meant more to me than any reconciliation with people who only valued me now that I had something they wanted to be associated with. My grandfather's final gift wasn't just the property or the money. It was the validation that I'd been right to protect myself, the confirmation that genuine relationships matter more than obligatory ones, and the freedom to build something meaningful without interference from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with my well-being. Every kid who walks through our doors and finds a chance they thought they'd never have is proof that he chose right, that I chose right, and that some wounds don't need to heal if the scar tissue is stronger than what came before.